The lead up to it was I was already working as a ringside doctor, and every year there was a ringside doctors convention, believe it or not, and it was held, of course, the yearly convention of ringside doctors, and it usually is held in Las Vegas. So it was a yearly convention in Las Vegas where all the fight doctors from around the country, like all 25 of us, no, I'm kidding, there's probably like a few more than that, got together, and then we talked about, injuries and how to prevent them, and kind of cool cases. And at the end of that conference, which was a few days long, they had a banquet. And at the banquet, they gave awards, and the guest of honor that night was supposed to be Oscar De La Hoya, which I was very excited about because he was my idol, and I got dressed up for him, ready. I skipped the conference, and I went to the pool. I was totally ready for Oscar, and Oscar didn't show up. And I was waiting, and I heard this sort of ruckus at the door. And I turned around, and it wasn't, there's a crowd around him, and as the crowd sort of separated, I saw that it was Mike Tyson. And I was not so excited because I was kind of scared of him. And one of my colleagues, he said, go get a picture with him. And I said, absolutely not. Like, I don't want to just be a groupie. I'm not going to go talk to him. But I was actually just kind of scared of him. So I went and sat down, and one of the other doctors who knew him introduced us, who was one of the doctors who was part of his analysis after the ear incident. And so he introduced us, and then before I could get a word out, the whole experience turned into this speed date. So we were sitting it was amazing. So we were, I was dressed, obviously I dressed up for my other date. And so he had me sit next to him at his table, and everyone was shooting pictures, and he starts telling me about his pigeons in Phoenix and asking me what sign I am. I mean, it was amazing. And I'm not going to try to do his voice because I'm not an actress. Lots of actresses. So then the night went on, and at the end of the night, I was leaving, and he said, no, wait, can you just hang out with us? And I was like, well, why? And he was like, me and my friends, just hang out with us. We'll hang out. And then, of course, I'm like, you don't say no to something like this. I'm so curious. And that was all I thought at first, was like, I'm so curious, which is probably the worst thing I ever say to myself. So this is what happened. As we approached the Maybach Mercedes awaiting him, I realized that everyone else had disappeared. We were alone. The driver stepped out and opened the door, and I felt pangs of apprehension. I could still walk away, but I wasn't one to walk away from monsters. Not when I was 16 and my mother locked me in my bedroom with my 300-pound stepfather to teach me a lesson, collecting bruises like jewelry with each slam against the wall. Or when 3 days later he showed up at my job to take my car, and I stood unmoving outside in the freezing cold, daring him to touch me again. Mike sniffled as we climbed into the car. Are you sick, I asked, deflecting my anxiety by changing roles. I'm an ear, nose, and throat doctor. I can help with that. Nah, I just like to party, he answered, chuckling to himself. He threw his head back and sniffed harder. I didn't know what partying had to do with having a cold, so he persisted. Wish I was lying. I like parties too, but you don't have to suffer. I think I understood that. He shook his head and smiled, not trying to explain what I didn't understand, then pulled out a small book of photographs. These here are my kids, 5 of them, he named. He named 4, stumbling on the last. He's the little one. Look at them chicken legs. He thinks he's a tough one. He laughed again to himself. This here is Neymar. She was a beautiful, light-skinned black woman who I remembered reading somewhere he'd met while he was in prison. She'd been a medical resident, and he had been her patient. He must have seen something familiar when he looked into my eyes, too. We arrived at the hotel, and I was told to wait in the car. Mike went in first, then the driver returned to escort me through the back entrance up a hidden elevator to Mike's room. Don't judge me. I had never seen anything like it. The palatial living space was encased with floor-to-ceiling glass windows, turning the Las Vegas Strip into a living painting. Michael Bublé crooned through the speakers. I relaxed on the couch watching as Mike rolled the biggest joint I had ever seen, and then fell into the chair opposite to me. He didn't offer to share. I don't anymore.
You don't need help?
I'm kidding. It's fine. So, doctor, where are you from? You're so precious, he said before breathing in a huge hit of smoke. I'm from the Midwest. My parents are Syrian, but my father's family comes from Chechnya. I'm sure you've never heard of Chechnya? No shit. I know the president. Me and him as friends. He explained how they had met in the French Riviera when he was there for a private visit. He told me about the people from the area, how they were warriors and fighters, how he respected them because they were some of the toughest people he had ever met. He knew more about my heritage than I did. The Russians, they wanted me too. You know how that goes. I had no. They got a little jealous, so I had to visit them after. He laughed to himself, reliving other memories he didn't want to share, and drew more smoke into his lungs. You my Chechen queen, he said, squinting his eyes at me. I had always been ashamed of my heritage, but I loved how those words sounded coming out of Mike Tyson's mouth. Tell me more about you, Mike. Where'd you grow up? Unlike most people, I didn't know much about his history. In truth, I had never cared before that moment. To me, he was just another angry, violent man who had come into too much fame and money and didn't know how to handle it. He told me about Cus D'Amato and how he had taken him under his wing and brought him into his home. Cus and his wife had raised him like their own, except Mike came with a suitcase of rage, a rage that could only be harnessed in the ring. When Cus died, so did Mike's sense of security. He was once again alone in the world. He took one last drag from his joint, nearly burning his fingers. That's enough about me, he said, humming along with the music. He leaned back and coughed, closing his eyes, tapping one foot and then the other. In his reclined position, his oversized belly rose in a mound, cinched in by the waistband of his pants. Rolls of skin gathered around his neck as he settled into the chair. After a few minutes, his breathing slowed, and unable to draw air in through his party nose, his mouth dropped open. A tiny snore vibrated across his palate as his chest strained to pull oxygen past his thick tongue. He was in no shape to fight anyone, not even his own demons. Are you tired, I asked, but he didn't answer. He was already sinking into slow-wave sleep. I stood and moved closer, studying how the glow of the light outlined his features. I touched his skin, brushing my fingertips across his tattoo. With closed eyes, I felt its raised edges, following the lines as they wrapped around his left eye, what some cultures believe is our weaker one. This Ta Moko was his shield, a permanent guardian as he looked out onto the world, and protector against all who looked in. His sleeping face gave away his secrets. His was a tribe of one. I opened my eyes and got very near to him, so near I could almost breathe in his breath. I kissed his forehead softly. It felt terrifyingly peaceful, like a prayer. On the way out of the hotel, I took a different elevator down to the main floor. The doors opened to a large space occupied by a full-size, empty boxing ring. Posters surrounded the area with pictures of Mike. On the ground in front of the ring was a life-size cardboard poster of him, gloved hands on his hips. The reproduction reflected nothing of the man I had just left. Boxing had given him everything, and because he didn't know how to hold on to it, had taken it all away. I wondered what it would try to do to me.